Hello there. My name is Jordan DeVries, and I'm the UI UX lead on Respawn Entertainment's Star Wars Jedi team. And I'm also, as you can plainly see, a lifelong Star Wars fan. Today, I want to talk to you about how we built an award-winning cognitive accessibility experience, and thank you GAconf for that award, specifically in the user interfaces of our game, Star Wars Jedi Survivor. Now, before we get to our game, we should really consider the broader interface environment that all of our players operate in, specifically apps and the web. All of our players are influenced by these interfaces, and players carry over, consciously or unconsciously, these habits and behaviors into our games. For brevity's sake, I'll refer to apps and the web as, quote, tech interfaces, as opposed to our, quote, game interfaces. So, what's going on in tech? Before joining the game industry, I spent over a decade working in tech, on UX projects for clients that include Autodesk, Facebook, and Royal Caribbean. And while a decade for me feels like a lifetime ago, tech interfaces have a longer history of contending with cognitive accessibility. On the web alone, cognitive accessibility was referenced in formal proposals starting almost 30 years ago. But when it comes to cognitive accessibility, it's critical to note that tech interfaces' goals are completely antithetical to game design. Tech wants to remove all friction. The advent of the primary button, at least on reputable websites, is a shining example of this. But whether it's an online store, a social media feed, or a smart TV, the goal is still to have the user think as little as possible. There's even been entire books written about this, like Steve Krug's seminal work, Don't Make Me Think. The ethics of this aside, there are two big impacts here. First, we have decades of expertise on how to make interface information as digestible as possible to a wide variety of users. And second, apps and websites and other devices are continuously competing for and consuming our attention. So, how does this impact how we build games? Well, for starters, games are all about making our players think. Whether it's clearing a line in a puzzle game or navigating to the next destination in an open-world game, intentional cognitive friction is core to the gameplay experience. That said, for vital information for the player, such as settings, cognitive friction should actually be reduced as much as possible. On Jedi Survivor, our UX goal was to tune this cognitive friction so that each player could have a satisfying, motivating experience. To do that, we need to recognize negative patterns our players may have adopted. For example, ignoring a pop-up ad might translate to ignoring a mission objective pop-up. But we can also benefit from positive patterns that players have adopted, like recognizing strong hierarchy or calls to action or shortcuts. Alright, let's talk about how we actually implemented all of this for Jedi Survivor. Part of our drive for accessibility simply rests on how many players can benefit from it. Star Wars is of course incredibly popular, but even so, we recently announced that 40 million people have played a title in our Jedi series. To support that massive player base on the UX side, we focused on three core areas of cognition: attention, memory, and understanding. In the end though, the benefits did prove to be near universal. Here are the 10 UX features we'll review and how they work with cognitive accessibility, from hints and reminders to our stances on information focus and depth. Alright, part 1, force hints. Preserving immersion in a game environment is sometimes at odds with a player understanding what verbs are available to them, especially when these encounters are less frequent. For example, in Survivor, we have certain binary objects that can either be pushed or pulled with the Force that receive a blue highlight. Now, even though the player has a 50-50 chance of getting it right and no real punishment if they get it wrong, this still always felt bad. We liken this to what we call the USB problem. Plugging in a certain type of USB cable can often feel like chance instead of skill. We initially drew a series of mystical force icons in an attempt to preserve this immersion, but this was ultimately more confusing than helpful. Our most successful test was simply labeling the correct button input, but only on critical path force objects, leaving side content highlighted but unlabeled. We also offered an option up front to toggle these prompts off for players that prioritize immersion above all else. In defense of these labels, it can be very tempting to over-engineer a solution or be entirely hands-off. We recommend talking to your actual players. In our case, Players felt fulfilled simply being able to use the Force and didn't even remember that a button prompt was instructing them to do so. Next, let's talk about navigation assistance. For a game like Survivor, exploration and the feeling of briefly being lost is part of the intended puzzle. And our puzzle areas can have multiple exits, some to the main objective and others to side content. A twofold challenge emerges for the player. First, where are these exits? And second, which of these exits lead to the main path? For our solution, we added a navigation assist beacon that would place a marker in our game's holomap towards the nearest exit that would lead to the main objective. We also kept this in the holomap and not in the game world, so that players that did leave this setting on had a chance of solving the exploration puzzles first before instantly being given a hint. And players could always just open the holomap immediately themselves if they really needed that hint. We also, of course, provided another upfront toggle for players that sought more challenge. We were completely surprised by an emergent use case for this beacon. We have players that prefer to explore 100% of an area before progressing the story. These players would leave this beacon on and actively avoid it until they were satisfied. In defense of this feature, there was a fair bit of internal concern about whether this would remove too much friction from all players, but in our game, knowing the end destination is only part of the puzzle. The rest is actually navigating our main character to get there. Now, let's talk about providing contextual reminders. As the exploration spaces and activities grow in a playthrough, we found it was easy for players to forget to redeem currencies they had already collected. This particular challenge is magnified greatly for players with learning, memory, or processing speed disabilities. But some of Survivor's traversal areas are fairly large, and we did not want to constantly distract players with activities, including some activities that would actually take a significant effort to detour back towards. Our solution was to set up a fairly large envelope around relevant activities like our Cantina hub shown here, that would trigger a one-time on-screen reminder. These reminders were along the way for where players were already headed, therefore complementing their gameplay instead of interrupting it. And using neutral language helps minimize the player feeling like they're doing something wrong. The platonic ideal of any in-game pop-up is one that complements what the player is already doing. They've found something, gained something, unlocked something. Reminders, conversely, are a lot harder to do well, so we try to make them as minimally invasive as possible. We still need in-game reminders though, as we cannot guarantee that players will regularly browse through menus, or even look closely at menus when they've paused their game. Alright, let's talk about duplicate UI. When first evaluating an interface, not only do different players look in different locations first, the sequence of what a player looks at next also varies wildly. When we conducted player research, common player behavior included looking for heading tabs, or looking at the brightest object, or looking at prompt trays, that is, the row of labeled inputs in the bottom row of our screen. We also can't guarantee how a player arrives at a given screen. For example, there are 6 ways of getting to Survivor's holomap, 5 from other menus and 1 from pressing the holomap key on a controller. We solved for this with duplicate UI elements like tab headings plus screen titles, or center buttons plus prompts in the corner of our screens. The other half of the solve is putting the same info on multiple screens, like our main objective or certain accessibility settings. In fact, we doubled up on accessibility settings being in multiple tabs because when we observed players, they started their search in multiple tabs. It seems counterintuitive that adding more redundant elements helps players, and this is a common stakeholder gotcha point of feedback to help simplify a screen. In reality, different players ignore parts of the screen entirely, commonly referred to as banner blindness in tech. So these button prompts aren't redundant, they literally do not appear to many players. That said, it's very important to be selective about the elements you choose to duplicate, as we also have players with increased visual sensitivities that will actually process everything on screen. Which leads us to determining focus in the information we present. As I just said, duplicates of the same UI element are generally net positive for players. Too many unique UI elements is where cognitive overload is most risky. Every player has a limit for how many unique elements they can handle before feeling overwhelmed, but players typically overestimate the amount of information that they can handle. If we show the player too little, they'll feel a sense of tunnel vision. The ideal limit then is slightly more than what each player can handle. Testing is the best way to determine what this threshold is for your players, but as a proxy, observing what level of UI scaling or even map zoom your players use can reveal how much information they're generally comfortable with. Let's look at some examples in practice. For the skill tree, we funnel all players through an overview screen that calls out useful details to guide players to specific subsections within the full tree. We also greatly limit the amount of skill tree you can see at once, and label both the major category and subcategory that the player is currently navigating. We could have fit more information, but this was the ideal level of focus for most of our players. This pattern of showing an overview first with shortcuts to various subcategories is one of our most successful interface patterns in Survivor. Even for players that know exactly where they're going, overviews provide shortcuts that let them skip more efficiently to their destination. This is one of the hardest decisions to defend and requires continuous vigilance. Why? Well, as your team gets more familiar with your interface over time, there'll be this natural pressure to bring forward more subcategories or detailed information onto this screen. Remind your stakeholders that even for the fastest reading players, all the information is still initially new to players, and the vast majority of your players will not be re-entering your menus over and over thousands of times in the same way that a game developer would. But most importantly, banner blindness is perilously easy to trigger, which is why we have to be very strict on how much information is presented on a single screen. So that's keeping a tight focus on information. What about the controls used to navigate this information? Well, we observed our players defaulting to a variety of different inputs when it came to navigating our interfaces. For example, some of our players prefer using thumbsticks to navigate, while others prefer the precision and cardinality of the D-pad. When it came time to exit a menu, some players prefer to use the same button they opened a menu with. For example, preferring to open and close a menu by tapping the same pause button twice. Meanwhile, other players prefer to leave a menu with a face button like hitting B or circle. Our solution was to simplify the interface controls and provide redundant pathways to navigate. So now, thumbstick and D-pad do the same thing, and exiting the pause menu can happen with either the pause button or a B button. Players no longer had to learn a special way of navigating our interfaces, which in turn reduces cognitive friction. This is another challenging decision to implement though, because it takes away the number of unique button prompts that are available to you as a game designer at any given time. But generally speaking, we found that if we felt the need for extra menu buttons, we were probably on the verge of making our menu too complex. Obviously, this is heavily genre dependent, and even we needed to break this rule with exceptions, like offering a floor switcher for our holomap that uses the D-pad. So, you've laid out your interface, you've focused your information and your inputs. Well, how do you best draw attention to what's new for each player? Our players are already constantly mitigating an influx of notifications from their other devices in their daily lives. We hypothesized that at a certain point, having dozens of new or unread indicators on lore entries, abilities, customization items, etc. would tap into the same notification stress. To make matters worse, these notifications pile up the less you use these menus, giving certain players a wall of unread icons. And frankly, giving these players a mark all as read option felt like a blunt instrument at best or an admission of defeat at worst. Our solution was providing a combination of two strategies. First, providing temporary highlights that self-dismiss, and second, unobtrusive, always available recaps. For example, in our character customization, unseen items are highlighted in a new category at the front of our list. Now, these same items are still available in their home categories for players that just want to customize a specific wardrobe type, which is another example of, quote, good redundancy. This category disappears when a player closes this menu, which may sound terrifying, but in practice worked well for our players. That said, I strongly suspect that if we had hundreds of new items or microtransactions or item stats, that we would probably approach this differently. In other screens, we provided recent lists that were always available for player perusal, ordered chronologically. But critically, these lists are secondary content as to not distract our players. This completely eliminated our need for new indicators in our databank, and it tested very, very well. As game developers, we don't want players to miss any of the awesome abilities, lore, and customization they've unlocked, and new indicators are a familiar UI pattern for players, which makes them extraordinarily tempting to use. Instead, our team vastly prefers to complement player intent instead of disrupting it, by making sure new indicators are used sparingly and with a short lifespan. So, our team provided recaps for collectibles. But what about all the other activities that a player gets up to? Well, our game features primary objectives, rumors, customization, collectibles, player upgrades, lore entries, and more. And we found that the further away from a main objective a notification was, the less likely players were able to remember acquiring game content. With some exceptions, we do have a passionate core of Poncho fans in our player base. Now, we found that this is true not just within a single play session, but also in a broader industry trend where game time is increasingly fractured. Players get interrupted in a single session, players juggle multiple titles, players pick up a game after months of not playing it. Our previously referenced Inbox Zero is great for single-purpose menus that are very intentional, like customization. But for the overall game, we needed a broader, permanent feature, which became our activity log, or activity list. On the main pause menu, we had an overarching aggregate card that could then be interacted with for further details on not just what was found, but how to proceed with it. Again, to keep players focused, this is presented in a secondary position as to not draw too much attention. In the future, we'd love to present more specific recap entries instead of the more generalized items we used here, but it was tough to do given the small footprint. Looking even further ahead, it'd be great to summarize where the player is in the overarching narrative if we detect that they haven't played in a while. We already provide these same story beats in our databank, so they could easily be moved front and center. We hope that all of our players will learn and internalize the journey we bring them on, but the reality is that memory is an increasingly significant cognitive challenge. Providing small recaps that don't interject or interfere with the player's intent is a great way to help reorient players without impacting too much of their focus. Now, providing players with quick recaps is only half the battle though. Ideally, the recaps should navigate somewhere. Enter related links. The information we present to players is multifaceted, interconnecting a variety of different features. For example, an NPC may give the player a rumor, which references a specific part of our holomap, which is currently under control of a specific faction that doles out a specific type of reward. But understanding and remembering where all these different aspects are across a sufficiently large game is challenging. There's a long-standing adage that players don't read. The concept of the Wikipedia rabbit hole directly disproves this, though. Or rather, players will read, or browse, or navigate if they're given the right level of interactivity in which to do so. Even players that struggle with text will engage deeper than they otherwise would if they're provided with sufficient interactivity and context. As much as possible, we placed deep link navigation shortcuts to related information so that players can fluidly navigate. For example, the combat tip entry also links to a lore entry on an enemy's faction. This type of contextual deep linking is already presented to players in their everyday life. Hyperlinks, hashtags, tagged accounts, etc., making it a comfortable and readily accessible pattern for games. Deep links means the players don't have to memorize our interface's navigational hierarchy or conduct interface U-turns to get to related information that may interest them. Now, depending on the complexity of the menu, it's a non-trivial exercise to quickly load a new system in for players, but the depth of player engagement we saw made solving this technical hurdle worth it. Finally, let's talk about keeping a record of talking, or conversation histories. We've already talked about recapping other types of information for the player, but dialogue and subtitles were perceived as a unique case by our players. Subtitles and captions can go a long way in helping players understand and retain what's being said, but not everyone reads at the same pace, and high action sequences can make retention extremely challenging. On top of that, in the Star Wars universe, some characters may use very distinct forms of grammar, or refer to in-universe terms and concepts that the player isn't familiar with. Our solution was to add a conversation log in our pause menu that players can review at any time. This log also includes several past conversations, and not just the most recent one, along with speaker names. This feature shoulders the cognitive load of remembering and understanding everything being said, allowing players to stay immersed and focused on the overall experience. But honestly, we were surprised by how popular this feature became. In the future, we'd want to service this even more directly instead of requiring several menu interactions to access. As I was researching the efficacy of this specific feature, 2 quotes stood out to me. I've included them here with permission. First up is my colleague and fellow accessibility champion Morgan Baker, who writes, "I'm deaf and have a traumatic brain injury. I can't read subtitles and play combat at the same time. This feature made me so happy." My second quote comes from Brooke Fitzwater, one of our players, who says, "Part of my autism diagnosis was low processing speed, so I love that if I miss a piece of dialogue because I was processing something, I can go back and look at what I missed." We've just discussed a lot about thinking, and I think it's a good time to close some of these thoughts, pun fully intended. For us, the core to removing barriers in cognitive accessibility ultimately boils down to keeping a very tight focus on what we present at any given time, providing backup methods for players to revisit information they were previously shown, and integrating these methods to complement behaviors the player was already undertaking instead of disrupting them. When this approach is directly integrated into the design process, we have a maximum benefit across a wide swath of players, including those who would not necessarily consider themselves in need of, quote, cognitive accessibility. Delivering this is truly a multidisciplinary effort, from layout to writing to the technical implementation that drives each of these features, and it would not be possible without working across multiple departments in the Jedi team, not just UI UX, of which we are eternally grateful. For this talk, I'd like to give special thanks to my colleagues Morgan Baker, Suzanne Clatton, and Jonas Lundqvist for their invaluable feedback and insight. I'd also like to thank the entire Jedi Survivor team for actually delivering these features and making this accessibility possible for our players. And finally, I'd like to thank the team at Lucasfilm Games for continuing to embrace our efforts as we strive to make Star Wars games for everyone. That's my time. Thank you so much for watching, and of course, may the Force be with you.